Dr. James Washington's fingers trembled as he dialed the FAA hotline mid-flight. Captain Brooks had publicly humiliated him, forcing him to move from first class despite his valid ticket. Now, with the entire Boeing 737 grounded and federal agents boarding, the pilot's face drained of color. Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed discrimination on public transportation, and subscribe to join our community of truth seekers. Now, let's uncover how a routine flight turned into a national scandal that transformed an entire industry. The morning had started like any other for Dr. James Washington. The African-American aerospace engineer and former Air Force colonel with 15 years of distinguished military service had packed his presentation materials meticulously. Today marked an important milestone in his career, delivering the keynote address at the International Aviation Safety Conference in San Francisco, where industry leaders would gather to discuss the future of air travel security. James adjusted his custom-tailored navy suit as he strode through Atlanta International Airport. The weight of responsibility rested comfortably on his shoulders. After decades in the field, he had earned his reputation as one of the foremost experts in aircraft safety protocols. His methodical approach and unwavering commitment to excellence had saved countless lives throughout his career. The business class lounge welcomed him with its familiar hush of privilege. James sipped his black coffee while reviewing his presentation one final time. The conference organizers had specifically requested his expertise on implementing next-generation safety systems across commercial fleets. His recommendations would likely influence aviation standards for years to come. When boarding commenced for Jetstream Airlines Flight 472, James collected his leather briefcase and made his way to the gate. His first-class ticket for Seat 2A had been reserved weeks in advance, specifically chosen for its extra workspace to finalize his presentation during the 5-hour flight. Group 1 may now board, announced the gate agent, her voice crisp through the terminal speakers. James stepped forward, boarding pass and identification ready. The agent's smile faltered momentarily when she looked up from his premium boarding pass to his face. Her eyes flicked between his documentation and his appearance, a hesitation so brief most would miss it. But James had experienced that momentary disconnect countless times before. "Enjoy your flight, sir," she finally said, returning his documents. James walked down the jet bridge, mentally shifting focus to his presentation. As he entered the aircraft, the lead flight attendant, Bethany Miller, a blonde woman in her mid-30s, greeted passengers with practiced warmth. When James indicated he was seated in 2A, her smile tightened. "May I see your boarding pass, sir?" Bethany asked, despite having just watched him board with first-class priority. James provided his documentation without comment. "Again, please," she insisted after barely glancing at it. "I need to verify." James produced his boarding pass a second time, maintaining his professional composure. Other first-class passengers, predominantly white executives in business attire, moved past with minimal acknowledgement from the crew. "Everything seems to be in order," Bethany finally conceded, her tone suggesting surprise. "That's 2A on the left." James settled into his spacious seat, arranging his materials on the side table. Around him, other first-class passengers exchanged pleasantries, discussed business prospects, and ordered pre-flight drinks. None engaged with James. Instead, he noticed sideways glances and whispered comments behind open newspapers. A silver-haired executive across the aisle stared openly at James, then leaned toward his colleague. "Standards certainly aren't what they used to be," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. James focused on his laptop screen, a strategy developed over years of similar encounters. The plane gradually filled with the diverse mix of travelers typical on a major domestic route. Each time Bethany passed his seat, she watched him with thinly veiled suspicion, as though inventorying the items he removed from his briefcase. When the aircraft reached 70% capacity, Captain Thomas Brooks emerged from the cockpit. The pilot, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and the confident bearing that came with thousands of flight hours, moved through first class, shaking hands and chatting with passengers. "Good morning, folks. Captain Brooks here. Beautiful flying weather today. We're expecting a smooth journey to San Francisco." The captain personally greeted each first-class passenger, except James. When reaching row 2, Brooks' eyes slid past James to welcome the passenger in 2B with particular enthusiasm. "Senator Williams. Always a pleasure having you aboard, sir. Anything you need, you just let our crew know." The distinguished-looking white man in 2B nodded appreciatively. "Thanks, Thomas. Still flying the friendly skies after all these years." Their familiar exchange suggested a long-standing relationship. Meanwhile, James remained deliberately invisible, his presence unacknowledged despite occupying the window seat directly beside the senator. As final boarding commenced, James overheard fragments of conversation between Bethany and another flight attendant near the galley. "Shouldn't be in first class. How did he even get that seat? Captain won't be happy." James had encountered this behavior throughout his professional life, the assumption that his presence in exclusive spaces represented some kind of error rather than achievement. He took a deep breath and returned to his presentation, determined not to let the familiar sting of prejudice distract from his purpose. The cabin doors closed. The safety demonstration began. James fastened his seatbelt, preparing for another routine flight of quiet indignities. He had no way of knowing this journey would become anything but routine. The final boarding announcement had just completed when Captain Brooks reappeared from the cockpit. Instead of returning to prepare for departure, he moved with deliberate steps toward row 2. The cabin hushed as he stopped directly beside James's seat, his imposing figure casting a shadow across James's open laptop. "Sir," Brooks addressed James with a tight smile that never reached his eyes. "There seems to be a situation we need to address." James looked up, his expression neutral despite the tension rippling through his shoulders. "Yes, Captain. We're experiencing some weight distribution issues with this flight," Brooks announced, his voice projecting to ensure nearby passengers could hear. "I'm going to need you to relocate to economy class." The statement hung in the air. Several passengers glanced up from their pre-flight activities, attention caught by the unusual request. James remained perfectly still, processing the captain's words with the analytical precision that characterized his professional approach to aircraft safety. "Weight distribution," James repeated carefully. "I reserved this specific seat weeks ago, Captain. I have a confirmed assignment to 2A. He reached for his boarding pass, extending it toward Brooks. The captain made no move to accept the document. "I understand that, sir, but as pilot in command, I have final authority over all seating arrangements. This is a safety consideration." James, intimately familiar with aviation protocols, recognized the invocation of pilot authority, and its misapplication in this situation. "Captain, weight distribution calculations are completed before boarding begins. Individual passenger reassignments wouldn't typically be necessary at this stage unless there's a significant operational issue." Brooks's jaw tightened visibly. "Are you questioning my authority on my own aircraft?" "Not at all," James replied evenly. "I'm simply trying to understand the safety concern that would necessitate moving specifically me from my assigned seat." By now, most first-class passengers were openly watching the exchange. From the corner of his eye, James noticed several people in nearby rows discreetly raising phones to record the interaction. "Look," Brooks said, lowering his voice but maintaining his firm stance, "first class has certain standards. You don't exactly look like you belong here." The implication hung heavily in the air, its meaning unmistakable. James felt a familiar coldness settle in his stomach, even as his exterior remained composed. "I assure you, Captain, I have a valid first-class ticket that I purchased weeks ago. There must be some misunderstanding." Brooks leaned closer. "The misunderstanding is yours. Now, we can do this the easy way with you moving voluntarily, or I can have security remove you for interfering with crew member instructions. Your choice. Before James could respond, the final passenger boarded, a white businessman in his 50s, slightly disheveled from rushing to make the flight. Bethany immediately approached him. "Mr. Patterson. We saved your seat up front. Let me show you to first class." The businessman hadn't even shown his boarding pass yet. James watched as Bethany escorted him to an empty seat in the first row, fawning over him with offers of a pre-flight beverage. That seat was supposedly needed for weight distribution, James observed quietly. Captain Brooks's face hardened. "Last warning. Move to economy, or I'll have you removed from this flight entirely." James glanced around at the watching passengers, the recording phones, the satisfied smirk on Bethany's face as she hovered nearby. He had experienced discrimination countless times before, had swallowed his dignity and chosen his battles carefully throughout his distinguished career. Making a scene could jeopardize his keynote address, the culmination of months of preparation. "Where would you like me to sit?" he asked finally, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. Brooks gestured for Bethany, who approached with undisguised triumph. "Seat 32E is available," she said. "Near the rear lavatory. One of the worst seats on the aircraft." The message couldn't be clearer. With deliberate movements, James packed his laptop and materials. He stood, straightening to his full height, and met Brooks's gaze directly. "I'll be documenting this incident, Captain." "Document whatever you want," Brooks replied dismissively. "Just get moving. We're behind schedule." The walk through the premium cabin felt interminable. James felt the weight of dozens of eyes following his progress, heard the whispers behind cupped hands. As he passed row after row in economy, the narrow aisle seemed to stretch endlessly before him, each step a public announcement of his demotion. By the time he reached the rear of the aircraft, James noticed 3 additional white passengers being escorted to empty first-class seats, the same section that supposedly had weight distribution issues. The systemic nature of the humiliation became crystalline in its clarity. Seat 32E placed him directly beside the rear lavatory, guaranteeing a constant stream of passengers and the periodic waft of disinfectant throughout the flight. As James stowed his briefcase under the seat, there was no overhead space remaining this far back. He took a single deep breath and released it slowly. This would not stand. Not today. Not anymore. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" James looked up to find a young black woman gesturing to the middle seat beside him. Unlike his forced relegation to economy, she carried herself with the confident bearing of airline staff. "It's available," he replied, shifting to make room. "Thanks. I'm Amara Johnson," she said, settling in and extending her hand. "Flight attendant trainee. Heading to San Francisco for my new assignment." James introduced himself with his customary professionalism, omitting his credentials and position. "Wait," Amara's eyes widened slightly. "Dr. James Washington? The aerospace engineer? I've read your articles in Aviation Safety Quarterly. Your research on turbulence prediction algorithms is revolutionary." Surprised by the recognition, James nodded. "That's me. What are you doing in economy?" Amara asked, then immediately lowered her voice. "I saw you boarding first class earlier." James briefly explained the situation, keeping his tone neutral despite the lingering indignity. "Captain Brooks," Amara said, her expression darkening. "I should have guessed. You're not the first, Dr. Washington." "Not the first." Amara glanced around before leaning closer. "I've been with Jetstream for 6 months. There's a pattern with certain crew members, especially Brooks. I've documented at least 7 incidents where black or brown passengers with premium tickets were downgraded for dubious reasons. Weight distribution is physically impossible as justification for moving a single passenger," James noted. "Aircraft balance is calculated based on zone loading, not individual seats. Exactly, Amara agreed. It's a convenient excuse because most passengers don't understand the technical aspects of flight operations. The seatbelt sign illuminated as the aircraft began pushing back from the gate. James watched through the window as ground crew disconnected the tug. His mind, trained to analyze complex systems for potential failures, began cataloging the incident within a broader context. "Do you have any documentation of these other incidents?" he asked quietly as the safety demonstration began. Amara nodded subtly. "I started keeping records after the third time I witnessed it. Nothing official. The company has ways of dealing with troublemakers. But I have dates, flight numbers, crew information." James considered this information as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. His original plan had been to file a complaint after reaching San Francisco, but Amara's revelation suggested something more systemic than an isolated incident of discrimination. Once they reached cruising altitude, the beverage service began. James observed how the cart moved methodically through the cabin until reaching their row, where the attendant served passengers across the aisle but moved past James and Amara without acknowledgement. "Excuse me," James called politely. "Could I get some water, please?" The flight attendant paused, visibly irritated by the interruption. "I'll come back," she said dismissively, continuing forward. She never returned. "Let me," Amara offered, discreetly retrieving 2 water bottles from her carry-on. Another common tactic. Selective service denial. Hardly obvious enough to complain about individually, but part of a pattern. James accepted the water gratefully. "How widespread is this?" "It varies by crew. Some flights are perfectly professional. Others." She trailed off, her expression saying what words couldn't. As the flight progressed, James connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi using his tablet. His position on multiple federal aviation committees granted him access to databases not available to the general public. He began researching Jetstream Airlines' history, finding multiple discrimination complaints that had been settled quietly or dismissed on technicalities. "Look at this," he murmured, angling the screen toward Amara. The data revealed a statistical anomaly. A significantly higher rate of operational reassignments, affecting minority passengers across Jetstream's network compared to industry averages. The pattern was subtle enough to escape casual observation but unmistakable under analytical scrutiny. "I've been collecting evidence too," Amara said. She discreetly removed several documents from her personal organizer. Internal memos about passenger profile optimization. Training materials with coded language about maintaining cabin atmosphere. It's all carefully worded to avoid explicit discrimination, but the implementation is clear to anyone paying attention. James examined the documents, his expert eye catching concerning details. These passenger redistribution guidelines directly contradict FAA safety protocols. They're using safety as a pretext for discriminatory practices. As they spoke, James noticed other concerning issues throughout the cabin. An unlatched galley cart. A partially obstructed emergency exit row. A lavatory door with a malfunctioning lock indicator. As an aerospace safety expert, these violations stood out like flashing warning lights. "This goes beyond discrimination," he said quietly. "There are significant safety protocol violations happening simultaneously." Amara nodded grimly. Cost-cutting measures implemented last quarter. Maintenance schedules stretched. Training hours reduced. Those of us who raise concerns get our hours cut or routes downgraded. James began methodically documenting each violation on his tablet, including timestamps and specific regulatory references. His decades of experience in aircraft safety transformed what might seem like minor issues to a casual observer into a comprehensive catalog of regulatory failures. The airline's chief operations officer, William Brooks, Captain Brooks's brother, pushed through these operational changes, Amara explained, showing James an internal organization chart. Most passengers never notice the corners being cut, but for industry professionals. It's a disaster waiting to happen, James finished, his concern deepening. While reviewing the documentation, James discovered something else. Captain Brooks had been involved in 3 previous incidents requiring official review, but each investigation had been mysteriously abbreviated, the records sealed by senior management. The system is protecting him, James observed. But why? Amara slipped him one more document, an internal bulletin about upcoming federal contract bids. Jetstream is positioning for a major government transportation contract worth billions. Any scandal involving discrimination or safety violations would disqualify them automatically. James absorbed this information, the pieces assembling into a disturbing picture that extended far beyond his personal humiliation. What had begun as an individual incident of discrimination was revealing itself as the visible symptom of a pervasive corporate culture that endangered passengers while systematically discriminating against minorities. This isn't just wrong, James said, his resolve hardening. It's dangerous. As the beverage cart made another pass, again skipping their row, James made a decision. This wasn't just about one-seat reassignment anymore. This was about systemic failure that threatened both civil rights and public safety. And he was uniquely positioned to address both. James Washington had spent his entire career identifying systemic weaknesses in aviation safety. Each protocol violation on Flight 472 was like a familiar red flag, pointing toward potentially catastrophic outcomes if left unchecked. The racial discrimination he'd experienced was merely the visible surface of a much deeper problem. What would you do if you discovered an entire airline was compromising safety while engaging in systematic discrimination? Would you keep quiet to avoid trouble, or would you take a stand regardless of personal risk? Comment number 1: If you believe speaking truth to power is always worth the potential consequences. Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed someone abuse their authority, and subscribe for more stories about everyday heroes who refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Now, let's see exactly how Dr. Washington planned to turn the tables on Captain Brooks and the entire Jetstream Airlines operation. I need to establish a secure connection, James whispered to Amara, pulling out his encrypted laptop. The aircraft's Wi-Fi would typically block most external communications, but James's government credentials provided access protocols few civilians possessed. Within minutes, he had established a connection to the FAA's secure server. "What are you doing?" Amara asked, watching as James navigated through a series of authentication screens. "Research," he replied quietly, fingers moving methodically across the keyboard. His first search revealed what he suspected. Captain Thomas Brooks had accumulated 17 passenger complaints over the past 3 years, significantly above the industry average. More concerning were the internal airline reports, 3 safety violations that should have triggered automatic reviews, all mysteriously resolved without formal investigation. How is that possible? Amara wondered, looking at the abbreviated case files. James expanded his search, following the digital trail. "There," he said, pointing to a recurring name in the administrative records. Gregory Palmer, Jetstream CEO. He personally intervened in each case. Further investigation revealed an unexpected connection. Palmer and Brooks had attended the same military flight school decades earlier, and Palmer had personally recruited Brooks to Jetstream despite questionable departure circumstances from his previous airline. "They're protecting each other," Amara concluded. "And endangering everyone else in the process," James added, his focus unwavering. He systematically documented each safety violation visible from his seat. The improperly secured galley equipment, the emergency exit row with partially obstructed access, the flight attendants skipping mandatory cabin checks. Each infraction represented a specific federal regulation, and James meticulously logged the corresponding citation numbers. The aircraft encountered a patch of turbulence, causing the seatbelt sign to illuminate. Captain Brooks's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some light chop due to uneven passenger weight distribution. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." James and Amara exchanged knowing glances. That's technically impossible, James said. Turbulence has nothing to do with passenger distribution. He's still trying to justify moving me. And reinforcing the narrative that you were somehow a safety concern, Amara added. James made another notation in his growing file. Federal Aviation Regulation 121.583 specifically prohibits false safety claims to passengers. That's violation number 23. As the flight progressed, Amara introduced James to another ally, David Torres, a senior flight attendant who had witnessed similar discriminatory incidents but felt powerless to intervene. The system is designed to silence concerns, David explained during a brief conversation near the rear galley. I filed 3 reports about passenger mistreatment. All disappeared into administrative black holes. Do you have copies? James asked. David nodded. I learned after the first one. I keep records of everything now. Would you be willing to provide official testimony if necessary? David hesitated only briefly before nodding. I became a flight attendant to help people, not to participate in discrimination. Whatever you're planning, I'm in. James continued building his case, constructing a comprehensive document that connected discriminatory practices directly to safety violations, making it a clear federal matter rather than an internal airline issue. His next discovery was particularly troubling. Using his security clearance, James accessed Jetstream's internal operations metrics. The data revealed a statistical pattern. Flights captained by Brooks showed consistent deviations from standard passenger distribution, with first-class sections showing dramatically lower diversity than the statistical norm. He's been doing this systematically, James realized. Selecting minority passengers for downgrading using safety protocols as cover. While the technical evidence mounted, James recognized that regulatory violations alone might not be sufficient. Public opinion and witness testimony would be crucial for any action to have lasting impact. He carefully photographed the visible safety violations throughout the cabin, ensuring his documentation would meet evidentiary standards. He also began discreetly identifying passengers who had witnessed his removal from first class, making mental note of their seat numbers for future reference. With each passing hour, James's strategy evolved from simply filing a discrimination complaint to orchestrating a comprehensive federal response to systematic safety and civil rights violations. His unique position, holding both aerospace engineering expertise and federal advisory authority, provided tools few other victims of discrimination could access. What's your endgame here? Amara asked quietly after observing his methodical documentation. James considered the question carefully. Justice, he finally answered. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been silenced by this system. And genuine safety for all passengers, regardless of their appearance. As Flight 472 continued its journey westward, Dr. James Washington transformed his economy seat into a command center for what would become one of the most significant aviation accountability operations in recent history. The humiliation intended to diminish him had instead ignited a systematic response that would reverberate throughout the entire industry. The captain had no idea who he had chosen to target, or what was coming next. 3 hours into the flight, James's systematic documentation had expanded into a comprehensive case file. What he needed now were witnesses willing to come forward, people who could corroborate his experience and strengthen the legal foundation for what would inevitably become a federal investigation. As if sensing his thoughts, a slender woman with a professional demeanor approached from several rows ahead. She paused beside his seat, speaking in a hushed tone. Dr. Washington. I'm Taylor Rodriguez, civil rights attorney. I was in row 15 when they forced you to move. That was textbook discrimination, and I filmed the entire interaction. James looked up, surprised by the unexpected ally. Ms. Rodriguez, I appreciate that. She discreetly passed him a business card. This isn't my first encounter with Jetstream's practices. I've been building a potential class action regarding their seating policies. Your case could be the tipping point. I'm documenting numerous regulatory violations beyond discrimination, James informed her quietly. The issues appear to be systemic. Taylor nodded grimly. That aligns with what I've found. I've already uploaded the video of your incident to a secure server. They can't delete or suppress it. After Taylor returned to her seat, another passenger approached during a restroom visit, an Asian American man who introduced himself as Michael Chen. I'm an off-duty pilot with Pacific Airways, he explained. That weight distribution claim was complete nonsense. Modern aircraft have precise computerized weight and balance calculations. Moving a single passenger would have zero meaningful impact on aircraft performance. I'd testify to that effect if needed. Thank you, James said, adding Michael's information to his growing list of allies. Throughout the cabin, a network was forming. A social media influencer who had been live-streaming pre-flight had captured the entire confrontation. She sent James a direct message confirming that the video was already trending under #JetstreamDiscrimination. The court of public opinion moves faster than federal investigations, Amara observed as more messages of support appeared on James's devices. What surprised James most was an anonymous text from a San Francisco-based Jetstream ground crew member. We've been watching Brooks for years. Multiple incident reports filed. All buried. We have documentation waiting when you land. The invisible web of people affected by Jetstream's practices was vast and diverse, from passengers who had experienced similar treatment to employees silenced through intimidation. James carefully organized these connections, ensuring each piece of evidence was properly documented and each potential witness appropriately vetted. We need to coordinate efforts, James explained to his growing circle of allies. Everything must be documented according to strict legal standards to withstand scrutiny. Taylor, with her legal expertise, helped structure the witness statements for maximum impact. Michael provided technical verification of the safety violations from a professional pilot's perspective. Amara continued sharing internal communications showing the pattern of discrimination was widely known within the company. As the alliance solidified, James discovered another critical piece of information through his secure federal access. Captain Brooks wasn't merely protected by airline management, he was family. William Brooks, the airline's chief operations officer, was Thomas Brooks's brother, explaining the consistent pattern of intervention whenever complaints arose. Nepotism at its finest, Amara commented when James shared this discovery. The network of allies continued expanding when James received another anonymous message, this one from someone claiming to be within Jetstream's corporate legal department. Check the government contract bid. Section 12.5 requires perfect compliance with anti-discrimination policies. One verified incident disqualifies bidders automatically. James quickly verified this information. Jetstream was indeed the leading candidate for a $5 billion federal transportation contract that would guarantee the airline's financial future for the next decade. The requirement explained the aggressive suppression of complaints and whistleblowers. They've been burying these incidents to protect their government contract eligibility, James realized. Amara nodded. That explains why management has been so ruthless about silencing internal concerns. Several flight attendants were terminated last quarter after raising discrimination issues. Were those terminations documented? James asked. Officially listed as performance issues, but the timing was suspicious. I can connect you with 2 of them after we land. James added this to his growing investigation file. The pattern shows systemic intent to conceal violations. That elevates this from individual incidents to corporate conspiracy. Another message arrived. This one from David Torres, who had been discreetly gathering information from other crew members. Previous whistleblowers were silenced through aggressive legal intimidation. Company attorneys threatened career-ending lawsuits for defamation and breach of confidentiality. The tactics were becoming clear. Jetstream had created a culture of fear to protect its discriminatory practices and safety shortcuts, using legal intimidation to silence anyone who dared speak out. They've never faced someone with federal authority before, James noted, continuing to build his case file. What had begun as one man's humiliation was evolving into something much larger, a coordinated effort to expose years of corporate malfeasance affecting thousands of passengers and employees. The allies James had gathered represented diverse perspectives but shared a common goal: accountability for a system that had operated too long without it. As Flight 472 began its gradual descent toward the California coast, Dr. James Washington finalized his strategy. The documentation was comprehensive. The witnesses were credible. The regulatory violations were numerous and clearly defined. But James knew from experience that powerful systems didn't surrender easily. Jetstream's leadership had successfully buried complaints before. They would fight viciously to protect their government contract and corporate reputation. The confrontation was inevitable. The only question was who would strike first. James was determined that this time, it would be him. Captain Brooks's voice interrupted the relative calm of the cabin approximately 1 hour before their scheduled arrival in San Francisco. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been notified of a potential security concern aboard our aircraft. As a precautionary measure, we ask that all passengers refrain from taking photographs or videos for the remainder of the flight. This is in accordance with federal regulations regarding aircraft security. Thank you for your cooperation." James and Amara exchanged knowing glances. No such federal regulation existed. It was a transparent attempt to prevent further documentation of violations. "He knows something's happening," Amara whispered. Within minutes, Bethany Miller appeared at their row, her practiced smile failing to mask the tension in her expression. "Sir," she addressed James directly, "the captain has requested that you surrender your electronic devices for the remainder of the flight. We've received reports of unauthorized photography of crew members, which violates our security protocols." James met her gaze steadily. "I'm afraid I must decline that request, Ms. Miller. There is no federal regulation prohibiting passengers from documenting their flight experience, particularly when it involves safety concerns." Bethany's smile disappeared entirely. "This isn't a request, sir. It's a direct instruction from the captain under his emergency authority. Failure to comply could result in federal charges." "I'm intimately familiar with federal aviation regulations," James replied calmly. "The captain's emergency authority extends only to genuine safety threats. Documentation of regulatory violations does not qualify as such a threat." Around them, several passengers had begun watching the exchange. Bethany lowered her voice to a harsh whisper. "Listen carefully. We know who you are and what you're doing. The airline has already contacted our legal department. If you continue, you'll be facing charges for interfering with flight operations, a federal offense carrying potential prison time." The threat was explicit, but James remained unruffled. "Please inform Captain Brooks that I'm proceeding according to Federal Aviation Regulation 91.8, which requires passengers to report observed safety violations. I'm merely fulfilling my legal obligation." Bethany's face flushed with anger. "Security will meet this aircraft upon arrival. Your devices will be confiscated, and you will be detained." After she stormed away, Amara leaned closer. "They're escalating quickly." As expected, James replied, continuing his documentation. Minutes later, passengers throughout the cabin began reporting connectivity issues with the in-flight Wi-Fi. James attempted to access his secure federal portal, only to find the connection failed specifically for his devices while other passengers maintained service. "They've blocked your MAC addresses," Amara observed. "Selective service denial. That's another violation to add to the list." James had anticipated this possibility and had already uploaded critical documentation to secure federal servers. What remained on his devices was backed up on encrypted drives that would require federal warrants to access, warrants Jetstream couldn't easily obtain. The aircraft's path suddenly deviated from its western trajectory, banking into a gradual turn northward. "We're changing course," Michael Chen confirmed from across the aisle, checking the flight map on his screen. "Looks like Denver. They're making an unscheduled landing." The intercom activated again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Brooks. Due to a security concern, we will be making a brief stop in Denver to address the situation. We apologize for any inconvenience and expect to resume our journey to San Francisco after a short delay. The implication was clear: Brooks was attempting to remove James from the aircraft before reaching their intended destination. Passengers murmured with concern as the aircraft began its descent toward Denver International Airport. James used these precious minutes to finalize his documentation and send secure messages to key federal contacts. Amara looked worried. Denver Airport security will follow the captain's lead. They don't have jurisdiction to question his authority. I'm counting on that, James replied cryptically, sending one final message before airplane mode would be required for landing. The aircraft touched down smoothly on Denver's runway, taxiing toward a remote area of the airport rather than a standard gate. Through the window, James could see several airport security vehicles waiting on the tarmac. Once the aircraft came to a complete stop, Captain Brooks's voice returned with an edge of triumph. Ladies and gentlemen, we will remain here briefly while security personnel address a situation on board. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Minutes later, 3 uniformed airport security officers boarded through the forward door. They consulted briefly with Captain Brooks, who pointed directly toward James's seat at the rear of the aircraft. The lead officer approached with practiced authority, his hand resting near his holster. "Sir, I need you to gather your belongings and come with us immediately." Passengers watched in stunned silence as the officers surrounded James's seat. "May I ask the nature of this detention?" James inquired calmly. "The captain has reported you for interfering with flight crew duties and unauthorized photography of security procedures. Both are federal offenses. You'll be detained for questioning and potential arrest." James nodded thoughtfully, then reached for his credential wallet. "Before we proceed, I should identify myself properly." He opened the leather case, revealing a federal identification card with embedded security features impossible to counterfeit. Dar. James Washington, Deputy Director of Aviation Safety Enforcement, Federal Aviation Administration. I'm conducting an official investigation into regulatory violations aboard this aircraft. The security officer's confident expression faltered. We weren't informed. I'm invoking federal jurisdiction under Title 49 of the United States Code, James continued, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent cabin. This aircraft is now under FAA investigative authority. Captain Brooks and this entire crew are to consider themselves under official review. From the forward cabin, Captain Brooks pushed through to confront the situation personally. "This is absurd. He's lying, we checked the manifest. He's listed as a civilian passenger." James turned to face the captain directly. "I was traveling incognito as part of a broader investigation into industry compliance issues, Captain Brooks. Your discriminatory treatment of me provided an unexpected but illuminating case study." He held up his secure phone displaying an official FAA case number. "I've just initiated a Priority 1 safety audit of this aircraft, this flight, and all Jetstream operations. Denver FAA officials have been notified and are en route. This aircraft is officially grounded pending comprehensive inspection." The color drained from Captain Brooks's face as the implications became clear. "You can't do that without cause. I've documented 37 distinct regulatory violations during this flight alone," James interrupted, his voice level but carrying authority that silenced the captain's protest. "Each independently sufficient to justify a full safety audit." The security officers, recognizing the shift in jurisdiction, stepped back uncertainly. Additionally, James continued, "I've cataloged a pattern of discriminatory practices that directly violate federal transportation equality requirements, particularly relevant given Jetstream's current bid for government contract transportation services." The cabin remained absolutely silent, passengers and crew alike watching the dramatic reversal unfold. Captain Brooks's expression shifted from outrage to the first flickers of genuine fear. James turned to the lead security officer. Please contact Denver FAA Operations and inform them that Deputy Director Washington has implemented Emergency Protocol 2941 Alpha. They'll understand what that means." As the officer stepped away to make the call, James addressed the stunned passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the inconvenience this will cause to your travel plans. This aircraft will not be continuing to San Francisco today. Alternative transportation will be arranged by federal authorities. The situation has evolved beyond a simple customer service issue into a matter of public safety and regulatory compliance." Captain Brooks lunged forward, his professional demeanor cracking completely. "You're destroying my career over a seat assignment. This is outrageous." James regarded him calmly. "No, Captain. You're destroying your career through systematic discrimination and safety violations. I'm simply ensuring accountability." Through the aircraft windows, passengers could see additional vehicles arriving, these bearing federal markings rather than airport security insignia. The audit had begun. The next 30 minutes unfolded with the precision of a carefully orchestrated federal operation. FAA officials boarded the aircraft, their expressions grim as they presented Captain Brooks with official documentation ordering the grounding of Flight 472 and the immediate suspension of his command authority. Passengers watched in stunned silence as Brooks was escorted from the cockpit, his captain's hat clutched in white-knuckled hands. The federal agents treated him with professional courtesy but firm control, making it clear this was no minor administrative review. James stood in the forward cabin, no longer relegated to the back of the aircraft, coordinating with the arriving federal team. His transformation from humiliated passenger to authoritative federal official was complete, his earlier treatment now cast in stark relief against his current command of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," one of the senior FAA officials addressed the cabin, "I'm Regional Director Peterson. This aircraft has been placed under federal safety review following numerous reported violations. We understand this disruption is inconvenient, and we're arranging alternative transportation to San Francisco for all passengers. Please gather your belongings and prepare to deplane in an orderly fashion." As passengers began collecting their items, many openly recording the unprecedented situation on their phones, Amara approached James at the front of the aircraft. "You never mentioned you were FAA Deputy Director," she said quietly. James offered a slight smile. "I was traveling privately to deliver a keynote address at the safety conference. My position wasn't relevant until Captain Brooks made it so." "Was this your plan all along? To conduct an undercover inspection?" "Not at all," James admitted. "I was genuinely looking forward to a routine flight and finalizing my presentation. But when confronted with such blatant discrimination and safety violations, I couldn't ignore my responsibility." Near the forward galley, Bethany Miller stood pale-faced as federal agents reviewed the aircraft's safety logs. The flight attendant who had treated James with such contempt now avoided eye contact, her earlier confidence evaporated. As passengers deplaned to waiting shuttle buses, James remained aboard with the federal team. The inspection was thorough and methodical, confirming each violation he had documented. Emergency equipment with expired certifications. Cabin fixtures that failed safety standards. Maintenance logs with suspicious gaps and inconsistencies. Outside on the tarmac, Captain Brooks was engaged in an increasingly heated phone call, gesturing angrily as he presumably contacted airline executives for intervention. His efforts appeared futile as more federal vehicles arrived, including one bearing the insignia of the Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Division. James's phone rang, the caller ID displaying Jetstream CEO office. "Dr. Washington speaking," he answered calmly. "This is Gregory Palmer, CEO of Jetstream Airlines," came the tense response. "There seems to be a significant misunderstanding regarding Flight 472. I'm hoping we can resolve this situation discreetly. The situation involves 37 documented safety violations and clear evidence of discriminatory practices, Mr. Palmer. Discreet resolution isn't an option at this stage. Perhaps we can discuss appropriate compensation for your inconvenience." "This isn't about compensation," James interrupted firmly. "This is about regulatory compliance and equal treatment under federal transportation laws. The fact that you're attempting to reduce systematic violations to a matter of personal inconvenience suggests you don't comprehend the severity of the situation." There was a momentary silence before Palmer's tone hardened. "You should understand that Jetstream maintains relationships with numerous federal officials. This heavy-handed approach will not serve your career interests, Dr. Washington. Are you threatening a federal official during an active investigation, Mr. Palmer? That would be inadvisable." The implied threat confirmed what James had already suspected. Jetstream's leadership was accustomed to operating with impunity, using connections and intimidation to evade accountability. "I'm simply suggesting a more measured approach," Palmer backpedaled. "These matters are complex and nuanced." "Indeed they are," James agreed. "Which is why the comprehensive audit I've initiated will extend beyond Flight 472 to all Jetstream operations nationwide. The patterns evident today suggest systemic issues requiring thorough examination." Palmer's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the phone connection. "That's completely disproportionate to a single incident." "This isn't about a single incident, Mr. Palmer. My preliminary investigation has already uncovered evidence of a pattern dating back at least 3 years. Additionally, your company's bid for federal transportation contracts necessitates complete regulatory compliance review." James ended the call despite Palmer's continued protests, turning his attention back to the federal team documenting conditions aboard the aircraft. The evidence was accumulating rapidly, each discovery confirming the extent of Jetstream's negligence. As evening approached, media vans began appearing at Denver International Airport, alerted by passengers' social media posts about the unprecedented grounding. Local news channels broadcast live updates as aviation experts speculated about the rare implementation of a Priority 1 safety audit. Inside the terminal, passengers from Flight 472 shared their videos of James's treatment and subsequent revelation of his federal authority. The footage spread rapidly across social media platforms, the hashtags #JetstreamDiscrimination and #FAAHero trending nationally within hours. James maintained his professional focus despite the growing media circus, working methodically with federal investigators to document every violation. His aerospace engineering expertise proved invaluable in identifying technical issues that might have escaped notice in a standard inspection. By nightfall, what had begun as one man's humiliation had evolved into a full-blown federal investigation with implications for the entire airline industry. Jetstream's stock price plummeted in after-hours trading as investors recognized the potential financial impact of widespread regulatory violations. Captain Brooks remained on the tarmac, his authority suspended, watching helplessly as his aircraft and career underwent forensic examination. The man who had wielded his power so casually to discriminate now found himself powerless in the face of federal authority. For Dr. James Washington, the transformation from victim to authority had been unexpected but necessary. As he coordinated with multiple federal agencies late into the night, he reflected on the strange twist of fate that had converted a routine flight into potentially industry-changing accountability. The humiliation had been real. The pain of discrimination familiar. But for perhaps the first time in his distinguished career, James found himself in a position to address the systemic issues rather than merely endure their effects. Tomorrow would bring congressional inquiries, media scrutiny, and corporate damage control efforts. But tonight, in the quiet efficiency of federal procedure, justice was taking its first measured steps. The following weeks unfolded like a methodically executed federal operation. What began with one aircraft expanded into a comprehensive investigation spanning Jetstream's entire fleet and operational structure. Dr. James Washington found himself at the center of a regulatory hurricane that grew more intense with each new discovery. 3 days after the Denver incident, federal agents with search warrants entered Jetstream's corporate headquarters, emerging hours later with boxes of documents and digital records. The company's carefully constructed facade of compliance crumbled under scrutiny as investigators uncovered years of concealed violations. Captain Thomas Brooks and 5 senior executives were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The airline's public relations department issued carefully worded statements about cooperating fully with authorities, but internal chaos was evident as the company scrambled to address systemic issues before they became public knowledge. James himself testified before a hastily convened Congressional Transportation Committee, his measured expertise lending weight to his account of both personal discrimination and technical violations. The issue extends beyond one incident or one airline, he explained to the assembled representatives. What we're seeing is the inevitable result of prioritizing cost-cutting over compliance, and allowing discriminatory practices to become normalized through systematic non-enforcement. The hearing was televised nationally, bringing unprecedented attention to issues that had previously remained largely invisible to the traveling public. James's dual perspective as both victim of discrimination and technical expert made his testimony particularly compelling. Dr. Washington asked Congresswoman Hernandez, in your professional assessment, did the violations you observed constitute an immediate safety threat to passengers? Several did, James confirmed. The improperly secured galley equipment alone could have caused significant injuries during turbulence. The obstructed emergency exit row reduced evacuation capacity below required standards. The cumulative effect of these violations substantially degraded the aircraft's safety margin. As the investigation expanded, hundreds of Jetstream employees came forward with their own accounts. Flight attendants described informal policies of giving preferential treatment to certain passengers. Maintenance workers detailed pressure to sign off on incomplete safety checks. Dispatchers revealed scheduling practices that regularly violated crew rest requirements. Amara Johnson became a key witness, her meticulous personal records providing a timeline of discriminatory incidents that corroborated James's account. Her courage in coming forward inspired others within the company to break their silence, creating a cascade of testimony that overwhelmed Jetstream's legal team. The airline's discrimination wasn't limited to passenger treatment. Internal hiring and promotion records revealed statistical patterns that could only be explained by systematic bias. Minority employees had been routinely passed over for advancement, relegated to less desirable routes, and subjected to harsher disciplinary standards than their white counterparts. Media coverage expanded beyond the initial incident, with investigative journalists uncovering similar patterns across the aviation industry. What had begun as one man's stand against injustice was evolving into a national conversation about both safety compliance and equal treatment in transportation. James maintained his professional focus throughout, working 16-hour days to ensure the investigation remained technically sound and legally unassailable. His aerospace engineering background proved invaluable in translating complex regulatory violations into terms the public and policymakers could understand. The technical and social aspects of this case are inseparable, he explained during a television interview. When an organization normalizes discrimination, it creates a culture where other rules are seen as equally flexible. The same mindset that justifies moving a passenger based on race also justifies skipping a safety check to save time. Jetstream stock continued its downward spiral as the extent of violations became public knowledge. Shareholders filed lawsuits against the board of directors for failure of oversight. Major corporate customers suspended their contracts pending resolution of the federal investigation. The investigation revealed that Jetstream's discriminatory algorithms extended beyond subjective crew decisions. The company's reservation system included coded parameters that flagged certain passenger names for additional scrutiny and automatically assigned lower boarding priority based on factors correlated with racial and ethnic identity. This wasn't just individual bias, James testified in his second congressional appearance. It was systematic discrimination embedded in their operational technology. Meanwhile, civil rights organizations coordinated class action lawsuits representing thousands of passengers who had experienced similar treatment. The legal pressure intensified when internal documents revealed executives had been aware of both discrimination and safety issues for years but had prioritized cost savings and government contract eligibility over addressing them. Captain Brooks's personal records proved particularly damning. His personnel file contained multiple complaints that had been removed from official records through his brother's intervention as chief operations officer. The nepotism that had protected him for years became evidence of corporate conspiracy to conceal violations. 6 weeks into the investigation, federal prosecutors announced criminal charges against 3 Jetstream executives for falsifying safety records, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to violate civil rights laws. The charges carried potential prison sentences, sending shockwaves through an industry accustomed to resolving violations through financial settlements rather than personal accountability. Throughout this period, James continued his professional duties while becoming an unexpected symbol of resistance against discrimination. He received thousands of messages from people sharing similar experiences across various industries, each thanking him for taking a stand that many had felt unable to make. For James himself, the experience was both validating and exhausting. The humiliation of that initial confrontation had not disappeared from his memory, but it had been transformed from a personal injury into the catalyst for systemic change. "I never boarded that flight intending to launch a federal investigation," he admitted during a rare moment of reflection. "I just wanted to deliver my conference keynote and return home." But when confronted with such blatant injustice, remaining silent wasn't an option. As autumn turned to winter, the investigation's findings were compiled into a comprehensive report that would forever change aviation oversight. The document detailed not only Jetstream's violations but also the regulatory gaps that had allowed them to persist undetected for years. The industry would never be the same. And neither would Dr. James Washington, the reluctant catalyst who had transformed humiliation into accountability. 6 months after that fateful flight, Dr. James Washington stood at a podium in the Department of Transportation's main conference room. Behind him, a banner proclaimed the official implementation of the Washington Protocols for Equitable Air Transportation. "Today marks not an ending, but a beginning," James addressed the assembled officials, industry representatives, and media. "The measures we're implementing aren't punitive, they're corrective. They establish clear standards that benefit everyone, passengers, airlines, and our entire transportation ecosystem." The transformation of the airline industry had been swift and comprehensive. Jetstream Airlines, now operating under new leadership following the resignation of its entire executive team, had become an unexpected model for reform, partly by necessity, partly by choice. The company's new CEO, Diana Roberts, had personally visited James in his office, not to negotiate reduced penalties but to seek guidance on meaningful change. "We want to be part of the solution," she had told him. "Our company failed its passengers, its employees, and its fundamental responsibility to safety. The only path forward is complete transformation." That transformation began with accountability. Captain Thomas Brooks and 7 executives faced federal charges ranging from civil rights violations to falsification of safety records. The courts had rejected plea agreements, insisting on full trials that would create public records of both the violations and their consequences. William Brooks, the chief operations officer who had protected his brother through years of complaints, received a 5-year sentence for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. His conviction sent a powerful message throughout the industry: nepotism could no longer shield individuals from responsibility. Beyond individual accountability, structural change spread rapidly across aviation. The Washington Protocols, developed by James and a diverse committee of experts, established new standards for transparency in passenger treatment. Every seat reassignment now required specific documentation, independent verification, and clear communication with affected passengers. Airlines implemented bias training that went beyond superficial compliance exercises to address systemic issues. Hiring and promotion practices underwent independent audits to identify and eliminate discriminatory patterns. Whistleblower protections were strengthened to ensure employees could report violations without fear of retaliation. Perhaps most significantly, the technical and social aspects of aviation safety were formally linked in regulatory frameworks. Airlines could no longer maintain perfect safety records on paper while engaging in discriminatory practices. The 2 dimensions were now evaluated as interconnected components of overall compliance. Amara Johnson, whose courage had been instrumental in exposing Jetstream's violations, now led the airline's newly established passenger advocacy department. Her team reviewed complaints not merely as customer service issues but as potential indicators of systemic problems requiring structural solutions. "We've transformed how we think about passenger dignity," Amara explained during an industry conference. "It's not separate from safety, it's integral to it. A culture that respects every passenger equally is also a culture that follows safety protocols consistently." James established a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing aviation careers, using the settlement he received from Jetstream as its foundation. The program specifically targeted underrepresented communities, creating pathways into an industry that had historically excluded them from leadership positions. The case became a standard teaching module in aviation management programs nationwide. Students analyzed not just the technical violations but the organizational culture that had enabled both discrimination and safety compromises to flourish unchallenged. On the anniversary of Flight 472, Jetstream's new CEO organized a public ceremony acknowledging the airline's failures and commemorating the changes implemented since. James attended not as an adversary but as a partner in transformation, his expertise helping guide reforms that went beyond superficial policy adjustments to address root causes. "What happened on that flight was inexcusable," Diana Roberts stated publicly. "But it became the catalyst for necessary change." Dr. Washington could have simply filed a discrimination complaint. Instead, he pushed for comprehensive reform that has made air travel safer and more equitable for everyone. The Federal Aviation Administration incorporated lessons from the Jetstream investigation into its oversight procedures, implementing what became known as Holistic Compliance Review, examining how airlines treated both their passengers and their regulatory responsibilities as interconnected aspects of organizational culture. Congress passed the Aviation Equity and Safety Enhancement Act, with key provisions specifically named after James. The legislation strengthened penalties for discriminatory practices, established independent review mechanisms for passenger complaints, and created new technical standards for compliance documentation. Throughout this period of transformation, James maintained his focus on practical improvements rather than personal recognition. When offered prestigious positions and lucrative consulting opportunities, he selected only those that allowed him to drive meaningful change rather than merely discuss it. The final scene of this remarkable journey took place on a routine commercial flight 1 year after the initial incident. James boarded a different airline, presenting his ticket to a diverse flight crew that reflected the industry's evolving composition. Dr. Washington, the lead flight attendant, recognized him immediately. "It's an honor to have you aboard. Your work has transformed how we all experience air travel." As James settled into his assigned seat, he noticed subtle changes throughout the cabin. Transparent documentation of passenger rights displayed prominently. Diverse crew members interacting respectfully with all passengers. A culture of professionalism that extended equally to everyone regardless of appearance. The captain, a black woman whose path to leadership had been eased by the industry reforms James had championed, personally welcomed him aboard. "Thank you for making this a better industry for all of us," she said simply. As the aircraft lifted into the clouds, Dr. James Washington reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment. What began with humiliation had culminated in transformation. Not just for one airline or one passenger, but for an entire industry and the millions of diverse travelers it served daily. The true measure of change wasn't in policies or protocols, important as they were. It was in the dignity now afforded to every passenger, regardless of appearance. It was in the culture that recognized safety and equality as inseparable components of excellence. It was in the legacy that would benefit generations of travelers who would never know the name of the man whose courage had made their journey more just. Dr. Washington's journey teaches us that systemic change often begins with individual courage. When faced with discrimination, he didn't just accept it or file a simple complaint, he leveraged his unique position and expertise to create lasting transformation. This story reminds us that injustice thrives in silence and secrecy. By methodically documenting violations and building strategic alliances, Dr. Washington transformed personal humiliation into institutional accountability. The story also highlights how discrimination and safety violations often stem from the same organizational culture, one that views rules as flexible and certain people as less valuable. When we tolerate bias in one area, we weaken integrity throughout entire systems. True leadership means standing firm when it would be easier to stay silent. Perhaps most importantly, this story demonstrates that meaningful change requires both moral courage and strategic action. Dr. Washington succeeded not just because he was right, but because he built an irrefutable case that connected personal discrimination to public safety, making it impossible to dismiss his experience as an isolated incident. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you had the power to change an entire system? What would you have done in Dr. Washington's position? Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on standing up against injustice. If this story inspired you, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more powerful racism stories, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that one person really can make a difference. Thank you for joining us today, and remember, sometimes the greatest acts of courage begin with simply refusing to move from your rightful place.